Welcome back, all you bulls and bears and betas out there, to the buzz of this Proxyopoly spin-off series we call the Proxyopoly Podcast. I'm your host, the Proxyopolist, formerly known as the Jackal of Trades. Here again with another exclusive, proprietary Proxyopoly TM research report for none other than JPMorgan Chase. That's right, Proxyopolists. Following the Proxyopoly scores for Deutsche Bank, BlackRock, Tesla, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Meta Platforms, Amazon, Spotify, Alphabet, Microsoft, Apple, Goldman Sachs, we now have on the docket today an exclusive, scathing analysis of the corporate governance mechanisms underlying one of the largest banks in the world and the single largest bank in the United States, JPMorgan Chase and Company. And I am particularly excited about this episode, Proxyopolis. JP Morgan's immense scale and influence make its corporate governance a matter of public interest and market stability. So let's get started, shall we? Introduction. JP Morgan Chase and Company, or JP Morgan for short, is not only a global banking behemoth with over $3.7 trillion in assets, but also a pivotal force in investment banking, asset management, and financial markets. This outsized role means that each proxy vote and governance decision at JP Morgan carries far-reaching implications for shareholders and the broader economy. The Proxyopoly TM score is a novel metric to gauge how a company's governance practices impact the public health of free markets, analogous to a financial beta measuring volatility. For reference, a higher Proxyopoly TM score, near 1.00 or beyond, indicates that a firm's governance structure and behavior introduce significant volatility and risk to market fairness, much as a stock with 1 beta or higher amplifies market swings. Whereas a lower or negative Proxyopoly TM score would signal a stabilizing or benign influence. In this report, we critically apply the Proxyopoly TM methodology previously used to evaluate peers to JP Morgan Chase, culminating in a final Proxyopoly TM score to be revealed at the end of this episode, and voting recommendations as well for JP Morgan's upcoming 2026 annual general meeting of shareholders. The goal of this podcast episode is to identify governance weaknesses and recommend reforms that could mitigate JP Morgan's outsized impact on market integrity. Recent evidence suggests JP Morgan warrants a particularly critical assessment. The firm has faced a litany of controversies highlighting governance and ethical shortcomings. It has been ranked the world's largest fossil fuel financier, pumping over $40.9 billion into fossil fuel companies in 2023 alone. A practice at odds with its public net zero pledges. Its asset management arm has been called out for, quote, greenwashing, unquote, its sustainable funds by investing hundreds of millions of dollars in coal mining giants through ESG branded products. ESG meaning environmental, social, and governance for new listeners. Prompting allegations of misleading investors and flouting the spirit of sustainability commitments. JPMorgan has also navigated major legal scandals. Notably, it was embroiled in the Jeffrey Epstein saga, having for years banked the late financier despite internal red flags, a failure that led to a $75 million settlement with the United States Virgin Islands in 2023. Additionally, the bank has paid record-setting fines for market misconduct. For example, a $920 million penalty for commodities market manipulation, and admitted to compliance failures in preventing illicit trading. These incidents underscore patterns of executive entrenchment, compliance lapses, and shareholder unfriendly practices that this report will examine through the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings to calculate a final Proxyopoly TM score. In the sections of this podcast that follow, Proxyopoly TM will evaluate JPMorgan on each Proxyopoly TM rating. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1, Proxy Accumulation Resistance. Proxyopoly TM rating number 2, Bylaw Fortification Index. Proxyopoly TM rating number 3, Shareholder Hostility Quotient. Proxyopoly TM rating number 4, Executive Entrenchment Factor. Proxyopoly TM rating number 5, Regulatory Evasion Measure. Each Proxyopoly TM rating, scaled roughly between -1 to +1, and again, the ratings can go beyond -1 or +1 given the egregious nature of conduct in either direction. Higher indicating riskier, more anti-shareholder or market adverse practices is assigned to the company based on concrete governance indicators, market data, and recent developments. Proxyopoly TM will then compute JPMorgan's composite Proxyopoly TM score, which we expect to be at the high end of the scale given the firm's dominance in mergers and acquisitions and noted governance problems. Finally, Proxyopoly TM will provide governance policy change recommendations to address the weaknesses identified, as well as the detailed 2026 Annual General Meeting Board voting recommendations for, against, abstain, or withhold on each director, backed by Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policies and guidelines, in addition to the company's track record. By scrutinizing JPMorgan in this matter, Proxyopoly TM aims to inform shareholders and stakeholders who are, quote, holding the proxy, unquote, on how this financial giant's governance could be improved to better uphold market health and investor interests. Moving on to Section 2 of this podcast, the Proxyopoly TM ratings. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy Accumulation Resistance, or PAR. Proxy Accumulation Resistance reflects the degree to which JPMorgan's ownership and governance structure resist outside influence, whether by activist shareholders, hostile bidders, or concentrated voting power. A high rating here suggests that management and incumbent insiders are insulated from shareholder intervention, making it difficult for outsiders to accumulate enough proxies or shares to effect change. JPMorgan's proxy accumulation resistance is extremely high. As a mega-cap bank with a market capitalization around $400 billion, it is practically immune to hostile takeovers. No rival could realistically acquire it, and regulators would likely block any attempt on systemic risk grounds. The firm's ownership is diffuse, with no single shareholder holding a controlling stake, but management maintains tight control over the proxy process. The board and executives have historically fended off activist pressures and shareholder attempts to constrain leadership authority. For instance, proposals to separate the chairperson and CEO roles, effectively diluting CEO Jamie Dimon's power, have been regularly defeated despite significant support. In 2024, a proposal on the ballot to appoint an independent board chair and thus strip Dimon of the chairmanship was opposed by management and failed, yet it garnered an eye-opening 42.5% of shareholder votes in favor of it. Over the past 4 years, similar proposals received between about 37% and 47.5% support, nearly half the votes in one instance. Such levels of support are unusually high for a governance change, indicating that a large minority of shareholders seek a check on management. Nonetheless, JPMorgan's leadership has thus far resisted these calls, leveraging support from longtime institutional holders and pointing to the bank's strong performance under Jamie Dimon to justify the status quo. The board even adopted a policy in 2022 that only upon the next CEO transition would the roles be split. And even then, the board reserved discretion to decide the leadership structure and did not commit to an independent chair. Proxy advisory firms like Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis have repeatedly recommended votes for an independent chair, warning that one person holding both chairperson and CEO positions creates conflicts and is untenable given JPMorgan's size and complexity. Yet management's influence and the company's sheer scale have thus far prevented shareholders from reaching the majority needed to force this change. In addition, JPMorgan's governance mechanisms make coordinated shareholder action difficult. While the company does allow shareholders to call special meetings and act by written consent, the thresholds are relatively high. Investors must hold at least 20% of outstanding shares to call a special meeting or take action. For a company of JPMorgan's size, 20% represents a colossal stake, tens of billions of dollars in stock, effectively precluding all but the largest institutional investors from exercising these rights. There is no single investor close to that ownership level, meaning no activist or minority group can unilaterally force a meeting. Even assembling a coalition of institutional investors to meet the 20% threshold would be challenging and unprecedented in JPMorgan's case. In short, management is well shielded from surprise shareholder revolts. Compounding this resistance is JPMorgan's regulatory halo. As a systemically important financial institution, it operates under heavy banking regulation that discourages any rapid change in control. The United States Federal Reserve must approve any acquisition of a substantial bank stake, and regulators maintain strict oversight of board and executive appointments. This creates an additional layer of insulation, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of banking laws, that fortify incumbent leadership against proxy accumulators. Activist hedge funds, which have targeted many companies in recent years, seldom target, quote, too big to fail, unquote, banks, like JPMorgan, because of this regulatory hurdle and because such banks often already trade near book value, leaving less low-hanging fruit for activists to, quote, unlock, unquote. JPMorgan's own actions further demonstrate its focus on warding off activist influence. The bank has even monetized its expertise by building an, quote, activism defense, unquote, advisory business to help other companies resist activists. In 2025, JPMorgan expanded this shareholder engagement activism defense team, hiring veteran bankers to bolster its capabilities. This group, led by senior M&A advisors, counsels corporate clients on fending off activist campaigns. A clear indication that JPMorgan's board and management philosophically align with defending management agendas against insurgent shareholders. Culturally, the firm prizes stability and continuity, often dismissing activist calls for drastic changes as, quote, noise, unquote. Jamie Dimon himself has been publicly critical of activist investors in the past. This mindset likely pervades internally, reinforcing a corporate culture that is resistant to outside proxy accumulation. Taking these factors together, diffuse ownership with no controlling shareholder, high procedural hurdles for collective action, regulatory barriers to takeovers, and a management culture averse to activist meddling, Proxyopoly TM assigns JPMorgan Chase a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.93 in its proxy accumulation resistance. This is toward the higher end of the scale, signaling that shareholders have very limited ability to accumulate proxies or shares to challenge entrenched management. In practical terms, management holds the proxy high ground at JPMorgan, and their positions are secure absent an extraordinary investor coalition or a regulatory mandate. This high Proxyopoly TM rating in the proxy accumulation resistance reflects that a single proxy vote, for example, on a crucial governance proposal at JPMorgan, is less likely to succeed in altering the company's course, as opposed to other companies, due to structural and cultural defenses. Proxyopoly TM rating number 2. Bylaw Fortification Index. The Bylaw Fortification Index measures how strongly a company's charter and bylaws fortify the board and executives against shareholder intervention. For example, anti-takeover provisions, supermajority requirements, board structures, and other governance provisions that can entrench management. A higher Proxyopoly TM rating in the Bylaw Fortification Index means the rulebook is stacked in management's favor. JPMorgan's bylaw and governance framework, while ostensibly shareholder-friendly in certain respects, still contains important fortifications that protect the incumbent board and management team. The bank does have some governance best practices on paper. For example, all directors stand for annual election. The board is not staggered. Each director is elected annually to one-year terms, and the company uses a majority vote standard in uncontested director elections. These practices enhance board accountability in theory, aligning with what JPMorgan's own proxy voting guidelines say. Quote, "We believe annual elections promote accountability of individual directors," unquote. Additionally, as noted, shareholders can call special meetings and act by written consent. Rights many companies don't afford at all, albeit at a fairly high 20% threshold. There are no dual-class shares at JPMorgan. It's one share, one vote, meaning no special super voting stock that management or insiders hold. These elements of the bylaws suggest a baseline of conventional shareholder-aligned governance. However, beyond these basics, JPMorgan's board has maintained subtle fortifications that tilt the playing field toward management. One key example is the handling of the chairperson/CEO duality in the bylaws or corporate governance principles. JPMorgan's board has explicitly resisted amending the bylaws to require an independent chair. Instead, in 2022, it adopted a policy, not a bylaw, that the next time JPMorgan has a new CEO, the roles of CEO and chairperson will be split, quote, subject to the board's determination, unquote, of what leadership structure best serves the firm at that time. Crucially, the board did not bind itself to make the chair independent. Jamie Dimon could hypothetically become executive chairperson when he eventually relinquishes the CEO title. Proxy advisors lambasted this policy as, quote, relatively weak, unquote, noting it lacks a firm commitment and leaves room for continued dominance by one individual. In effect, the board kept discretion to not truly empower an independent check on management, preserving a fortified leadership culture. Another fortifying bylaw element is the absence of shareholder rights to remove directors without cause or to fill board vacancies. Like many Delaware companies, JPMorgan's charter likely permits the board to fill any vacancy, including newly created directorships, and may require cause for mid-term removal of a director. This means shareholders cannot easily oust a director outside of the annual meeting cycle, and if a director dies or resigns, the remaining board members choose the replacement, often selecting someone aligned with themselves. Such provisions, while standard, contribute to management entrenchment by limiting shareholders' ability to effect immediate change. Supermajority vote requirements also come into play. While JPMorgan has moved towards majority voting in elections, certain fundamental changes like amending certain charter provisions may still require a supermajority vote. For instance, historically, many bank charters require 67 or 80% approval to change provisions related to board structure or director removal. If JPMorgan retains any such supermajority requirements, that would significantly fortify those provisions against alteration by an activist shareholder vote. Many companies have eliminated supermajority requirements in recent years under shareholder pressure. If JPMorgan seeks to do so, that would be a point in favor of shareholders. However, no explicit reference to supermajority removal is noted in recent proxy statements we have reviewed. Additionally, proxy access, the ability for shareholders to nominate directors on the company's proxy, is allowed by JPMorgan, but likely on fairly restrictive terms, typically requiring a shareholder or group holding 3% of shares for 3 years and limiting the number of board seats that can be nominated to, say, 20% of the board. Proxy access at JPMorgan has not yet been used by shareholders to recent knowledge, which may indicate either satisfaction with the board or the difficulty of mounting such a campaign at a firm this large. The presence of proxy access is shareholder-friendly in theory, but the real test is whether the thresholds are workable. Given the size of the bank, even 3% of JPMorgan's shares is a huge stake, about $12 to $15 billion huge, and holding it for 3 years is a high bar, effectively limiting proxy access to only the largest institutional investors or a consortium thereof. One recent change that shows how bylaws can be adjusted to management's benefit is the director age limit. JPMorgan's board, in 2021, raised the mandatory retirement age for directors from 72 to 75. This move, quote, to better align with peers and expand the pool of director candidates, unquote, conveniently also allows long-tenured directors and potentially Mr. Dimon in the chairperson role to stay on the board longer. For example, Stephen Burke and Linda Bammann, both long-serving directors nearing traditional retirement age, can now continue until 75. Jamie Dimon himself is 69, nice, and could serve as an executive or non-executive chair past 72 up to age 75 under this revised policy. While not an outright anti-takeover provision, raising the age limit fortifies board continuity and delays opportunities for natural refreshment by age turnover, thereby entrenching the existing leadership for a few more years. It's telling that this policy change came as key directors were in their late 60s. A preemptive fortification to keep trusted allies in place longer. In terms of anti-takeover defenses like poison pills or shareholder rights plans, JPMorgan does not currently have an active poison pill in effect, and any pill at a bank would invite regulatory scrutiny. However, the need for a pill is low, given the size and regulatory factors noted. If faced with a creeping accumulation of shares by an unwelcome party, the board could likely adopt a poison pill quickly. Or just take Adderall like all of its analysts on the floor. The mere fact that regulators cap ownership by any one party, typically 10% triggers Fed oversight, acts as a quasi-poison pill already. Considering all of the above, JPMorgan's Bylaw Fortification Index is assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.85. This reflects a moderately high level of structural protection for management. On one hand, JPMorgan meets minimum best practices, annual elections, no dual class shares, etc., preventing this Proxyopoly TM rating in the Bylaw Fortification Index from exceeding positive 1. On the other hand, the nuances in its governance, reluctance to empower an independent chair, relatively high action thresholds, extended director tenure allowances, tilt in favor of entrenched leadership. The board has been willing to tweak rules to maintain control, as seen with retirement age and their guarded compromise on future leadership structure. Compromises in quotes. The result is a governance framework that gives the appearance of shareholder friendliness, but ultimately still fortifies the status quo. Shareholders can voice dissent, but altering fundamental governance requires overwhelming consensus or the board's blessing, both difficult to obtain. In summary, JPMorgan's bylaws and policies provide just enough checks to satisfy basic governance standards, yet retain sufficient fortifications to keep management comfortably in charge. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 3, Shareholder Hostility Quotient, or SHQ. The Shareholder Hostility Quotient captures how hostile or dismissive JPMorgan's management and board are toward shareholder concerns, proposals, and interests. A high quotient means the company frequently opposes shareholder initiatives, exhibits poor responsiveness to investor votes, or otherwise acts antagonistically towards shareholder rights and feedback. JPMorgan's shareholder hostility quotient is quite elevated, we can say this much right now. The bank's leadership has a record of stonewalling or undercutting shareholder initiatives, especially on environmental, social, and governance (ESG) issues, and only grudgingly implementing changes when forced. Several data points illustrate this posture. Opposition to shareholder proposals. At the 2025 annual general meeting, as in prior years, JPMorgan's board recommended against every single shareholder proposal on the ballot. This is a consistent pattern. Management routinely urges shareholders to vote down all outside proposals, regardless of merit. In 2023 and 2024, shareholder-sponsored proposals ranged from climate action plans to racial equity audits to political lobbying disclosure. JPMorgan's typical response has been to engage with proponents privately, sometimes offering superficial concessions, but ultimately to use its proxy muscle to defeat the proposals. For example, climate-related proposals asking the bank to set stricter targets on financed emissions received only 11% and 15% support on the ballot in 2022 after JPMorgan's board opposed them. Paralleling weak support at other big banks and oil companies. The low vote tallies owe in part to management's influence and major investors' alignment with the board. Despite widespread public concerns about climate issues, JPMorgan shareholders have been persuaded or felt compelled to vote with management, indicating a management successful in fending off activist resolutions. Another data point illustrating the posture for the shareholder hostility quotient. Ignoring significant shareholder votes. When shareholders do express disapproval, JPMorgan's responsiveness has been mixed at best. A stark example was the 2022 Say on Pay vote. That year, only 31% of shareholders approved JPMorgan's executive compensation package. A resounding rejection driven by outrage over a special $52.6 million one-time stock option award granted to CEO Jamie Dimon. This was an, quote, unusual rebuke, unquote, for Jamie Dimon and the board, as historically over 90% supported JPM's pay plans. Proxy advisors like Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis had recommended voting against the Say on Pay proposal due to the outsized performance-free nature of Dimon's award. Shareholders followed suit, handing Dimon a rare loss. How did the board respond? Directors acknowledged the vote outcome and promised that such a special award was, quote, extremely rare, unquote, and would not be recurring. They did not, however, claw back or adjust the award. Dimon kept it. Essentially, the board's response was, quote, we hear you, but trust us, we won't do it again, unquote, without materially changing anything for the year in question. By 2023's annual general meeting, no new special grants given, Say on Pay support rebounded, and management considered the issue closed. This episode illustrates a pattern. The board will generally only concede as much as needed to quell investor dissent, but not necessarily fully align with the expressed shareholder will. A 31% approval is an alarm bell in corporate governance, yet JPMorgan's response was minimal and aimed at managing optics. Another data point for the shareholder hostility quotient is token gestures versus real change. JPMorgan often prefers engagement and half measures to blunt shareholder critiques rather than full accommodation. A case in point is how it handled a shareholder proposal filed for the 2023 meeting by the New York City Comptroller, asking the bank to disclose the ratio of its fossil fuel financing to clean energy financing, rather than let this resolution go to a vote. Risking significant support, JPMorgan negotiated an agreement and voluntarily agreed to provide that disclosure, leading the proponent to withdraw the proposal. On one hand, this is a positive, collaborative outcome. On the other hand, it's a savvy way for management to avoid an explicit shareholder mandate that might encourage more of such activism. JPMorgan's agreement to this request came only after pressure. It was not something the bank's leadership offered proactively. Indeed, Adele Schreiman of the Sierra Club noted that big banks, quote, squandered yet another year, unquote, without decisive climate action, failing to set sufficient interim targets or plans for fossil fuel reduction. This indicates that while JPMorgan will engage in dialogue and make selective concessions, it remains fundamentally reluctant to embrace shareholder-driven reforms, unless faced with reputational risk or the likelihood of a majority vote against it. Another data point underlying the shareholder hostility quotient are ESG and stakeholder issues. In areas of environmental and social responsibility, where many shareholders, especially large asset managers and European investors, have raised concerns, JPMorgan's posture has verged on hostility to the ESG movement. The firm's asset management division recently made headlines for withdrawing from the flagship Climate Action 100 investor coalition, a group pressing companies on carbon emissions. In February 2024, JPMorgan Asset Management abruptly quit the Climate Action 100 rather than agree to the coalition's tougher Phase 2 requirements for climate engagement. This move, along with similar exits by peer firms, drew sharp criticism from environmental groups. The Sierra Club labeled it, quote, a major asset manager cave, unquote, to anti-ESG political attacks. By pulling out, JPMorgan signaled to climate-conscious shareholders that it would go its own way on climate engagement and not be constrained by collective investor initiatives. Essentially a rebuke to those who want more aggressive climate action. Similarly, JPMorgan has faced shareholder proposals asking it to phase out financing for new fossil fuel projects. Management has vigorously opposed these, arguing it will manage climate risks on its own terms. Year after year, these proposals have been defeated, and JPMorgan continues to be the number one banker of fossil fuels globally with $430 billion financed since 2016. The persistence of such financing, combined with stepping back from investor climate alliances, reads as hostility towards the ESG priorities that a segment of shareholders and society advocate. Even with its own sustainable investing products, JPMorgan's practices have invited censure. As mentioned, the bank's so-called, quote, sustainable, unquote, funds were found to be investing in Glencore, a coal-heavy mining firm with egregious environmental violations. When confronted with this in 2025, JPMorgan Asset Management declined to comment and has not announced any overhaul of its fund criteria. This defensive, closed ranks response suggests a reluctance to admit fault or make changes even when ESG missteps are exposed. An implicit hostility to the concerns of ethical investors. Another data point underscoring the shareholder hostility quotient is shareholder engagement versus action. JPMorgan's public communications always stress how much time the board and the senior management spend engaging with shareholders on a range of issues. They tout dialogues and outreach efforts. However, the true test of engagement is whether shareholder input translates into policy changes. In JPMorgan's case, meaningful change tends to lag or be forced. For example, only after large voting blocs signaled support for an independent chair did the board slightly soften its stance, with the weak future split policy previously mentioned. Only after a disastrous say-on-pay vote did the board promise to restrain one-off awards. Only after significant client pressure did the bank agree to publish some climate metrics. These all suggest that JPMorgan's default is to say no to shareholder ideas until resistance becomes potentially costly, rather than seeking to lead in incorporating shareholder feedback. Taken together, Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating for JPMorgan Chase in its shareholder hostility quotient of positive 0.90. This high Proxyopoly TM rating in the shareholder hostility quotient for JPMorgan reflects a pattern of management and board intransigence in the face of shareholder initiatives, and a tendency to view shareholder proposals as adversarial challenges to be overcome rather than ideas to be embraced. While JPMorgan isn't outright abusive to shareholders, it does hold annual meetings, it doesn't have dual-class stock disenfranchising investors, and it does engage in conversations. Its track record shows minimal accommodation of shareholder-driven governance improvements. The bank's leaders often project an attitude that they know best and that outsiders, be they activists, socially concerned investors, or even a significant minority of their own shareholders, should not dictate company policy. This subtly combative stance towards shareholder input keeps the quotient high. It is worth noting that this hostility quotient has likely risen in recent years as JPMorgan faced more challenges on issues like climate change and executive pay and chose to push back strongly rather than lead by example. Until we see JPMorgan proactively adopt measures championed by shareholders rather than reacting only when under pressure, the shareholder hostility quotient will remain on the upper end of the spectrum, where it is now, at positive 0.90. Moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 4. The executive entrenchment factor. The executive entrenchment factor evaluates how firmly entrenched JPMorgan's top executives, particularly CEO Jamie Dimon, and longtime directors are, and whether the governance setup perpetuates their power beyond what is healthy. It considers tenure, succession planning, consolidation of roles, and any mechanisms insulating executives from accountability. A value near or above 1 indicates extreme entrenchment beyond market norms. JPMorgan's executive entrenchment factor is arguably off the charts. Anchored by the extraordinary reign of Jamie Dimon and a cohort of long-tenured directors deeply loyal to him. Jamie Dimon has been JPMorgan's CEO since 2005 and chairperson since 2006. A 20-year run that is almost unheard of in modern finance for a chief executive of a major bank. Under Dimon's leadership, the bank has prospered financially, which has ironically reinforced his untouchable status. But such longevity also concentrates power and institutional knowledge in one person, raising governance concerns. Despite approaching age 70, Dimon has given mixed signals about succession. Only recently in 2023 did he hint at his tenure as CEO, quote, is not 5 years anymore, unquote, suggesting a shorter remaining horizon. The board claims succession planning is, quote, well underway. Yet, no public timeline or designated successor has been revealed, which means Dimon's grip remains strong. The board's move to dangle a massive retention bonus to keep him around in 2021, a $52 million option grant, further exemplifies how far they will go to entrench Dimon at the helm, even at the cost of a shareholder revolt on pay packages. Entrenchment is also evident in the combination of CEO and chairperson roles in Dimon's hands. This dual role, maintained for nearly 2 decades, means Dimon effectively oversees the board that is supposed to oversee him. It concentrates oversight, strategy, and shareholder interface into a single office. Many governance experts argue that such an arrangement can significantly weaken board independence and the board's ability to act as a check on the CEO. At JPMorgan Chase, attempts to separate the roles have been consistently resisted, as discussed earlier. And even large minority votes have not dislodged Dimon from the chair. The board's half-hearted pledge to maybe split roles after Dimon is gone, and even then possibly making him executive chair, underscores that entrenchment mindset. They codified that Dimon's combined power would remain unchallenged for as long as Dimon is CEO and potentially beyond. The board composition and tenure further amplify executive entrenchment. Several directors have served extremely long tenures, often developing personal loyalty or deferential relationships with Dimon. For instance, Stephen Burke and James Crown, until his recent passing in 2023, both joined the board in 2004. At the time, Dimon came on board via Bank One. Burke remained a director for 21 years later. Linda Bammann joined in 2013 and is a former JPMorgan executive, which may make her sympathetic to management's perspective. The presence of these long-serving directors, including those who literally helped hire or worked alongside Dimon, can inhibit robust challenge to the CEO. They are deeply familiar with and arguably invested in the Dimon-era status quo, and until recently, the board's average tenure was quite high. Only in the last few years has JPMorgan added a handful of new directors. Buck, Smith, Weinberger, Davis, to inject fresh blood. However, the key committees, audit, risk, compensation, remain chaired by older, long-tenured members. For example, Burke chairs Compensation and Management Development, Bammann chairs Risk, and new director Mark Weinberger, a respected outsider, chairs the Audit Committee. The Compensation Committee's handling of Dimon's pay packages, approving the special award without performance conditions, suggests a degree of captivity or deference to the CEO by supposedly independent directors. Only a highly entrenched CEO could receive such an extraordinary payout with minimal pushback internally. The backlash came from shareholders instead. Another dimension is how the company responds to executive lapses or controversies. Accountability for top executives at JPMorgan has been limited. Consider high-profile incidents. The 2012, quote, London whale, unquote, trading debacle, a $6 billion loss from risky trades, led to some shakeups in lower management and a clawback of bonuses from those directly involved. But Jamie Dimon largely escaped with a self-administered mea culpa. and a temporary pay cut. The board did not seriously consider any change in leadership or reduction in his authority following that risk management failure. A stark contrast to how other banks have ousted CEOs after smaller mishaps. More recently, the bank's entanglement with Jeffrey Epstein, who was a JPMorgan client from 1998 to 2013, raised questions about management oversight of high-risk clients. Internal emails showed that concerns about Epstein reached up to certain senior executives, yet the relationship persisted until long after Epstein's conviction. When lawsuits hit in 2022 to 2023, JPMorgan's defense pointed to a single former private banking head, Jess Staley, as the responsible party, effectively shielding current leadership. Dimon testified he barely knew of Epstein until 2019. Ultimately, JPMorgan paid out settlements, but there were no public indications of censure or penalty for any current top executive over this grievous compliance lapse. This pattern: problems result in fines in settlements, but top leadership stays intact and unapologetic, evidences executive insulation from consequences. It implies that the CEO and his inner circle operate with a safety net not afforded to lower-level employees or less entrenched executives. The board's structural decisions also reveal entrenchment intent. The extension of director retirement ages to 75, as noted, was clearly designed to keep longtime allies around longer. It also means Jamie Dimon, if he steps down at CEO around, say, 70, could plausibly continue as a board member or even chairperson for another 5 years without breaching any age limit. The board has made no commitment to rotate committee chairs or bring in an independent lead director with truly robust powers. JPMorgan does have a lead independent director, however. Currently, Lee Raymond, until recently, now likely one of the senior independents. But their influence, in the face of Dimon's combined role, is questionable. It is worth contrasting JPMorgan's entrenchment with peers. Many other large financial institutions have separated chairperson, CEO roles. For example, Bank of America's Brian Moynihan was compelled to accept an independent chair for several years after 2009. Wells Fargo separated roles after scandals. JPMorgan stands out as the major bank that steadfastly refuses to separate power at the top while the CEO is in place. This stubbornness is a hallmark of entrenchment. Mike Mayo, a banking analyst, has even defended Dimon's unique status by saying he's a one-of-a-kind CEO and thus should be allowed to have unified authority. An argument essentially that the normal rules shouldn't apply to JPMorgan's leader? Such attitudes feed the cult of personality and exceptionalism that entrenches executives from accountability. Given these factors, Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.98 as JPMorgan's executive entrenchment factor. Positive 0.98 effectively at the summit of the scale, although scores can go above positive 1.00 in egregious cases. Jamie Dimon's dominance over JPMorgan strategy, culture, and governance, reinforced by a compliant board, exemplifies executive entrenchment. The slight difference from a theoretical rating above positive 1.00 is only because JPMorgan has at least taken baby steps to start succession planning. For example, grooming potential heirs apparent, acknowledging the issue in public, and because a few new independent directors have joined who might eventually challenge the old guard. Keyword there is might. However, at this moment, power is heavily concentrated. The risk here is that such entrenchment can breed groupthink and complacency. When a leader is deemed irreplaceable, the normal checks and balances of corporate governance weaken. For shareholders, a Proxyopoly TM rating for the executive entrenchment factor of positive 0.98 indicates that management operates with near total autonomy and minimal fear of removal, short of a catastrophic performance or external intervention. It will likely take the actual departure of Jamie Dimon by retirement or otherwise to reset the executive entrenchment factor to a healthier par level. And now, moving on to Proxyopoly TM rating number 5. Regulatory Evasion Measure. The Regulatory Evasion Measure assesses JPMorgan's propensity to evade, circumvent, or unduly influence regulations and legal oversight. This includes the bank's record of regulatory compliance or non-compliance, lobbying to soften rules, and any pattern of pushing the envelope of what's permissible. A high Proxyopoly rating in the category of regulatory evasion measure would suggest that the company frequently skirts regulations or exploits loopholes to its advantage, potentially harming market integrity or broader societal interests. JPMorgan's Proxyopoly TM rating in the category of regulatory evasion measure is quite high, owing to a history of legal violations and a strategy of aggressive lobbying against stricter regulatory oversight. While JPMorgan is a heavily regulated bank, it has often been at odds with regulators, paying enormous fines for misconduct and campaigning to water down rules that constrain its activities. On the compliance front, JPMorgan's rap sheet is extensive. The bank has paid tens of billions in fines and settlements over the past decade for a variety of infractions, from mortgage securities abuses in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis to bribery of officials in Asia, namely the 2016, quote, sons and daughters hiring scandal, to market manipulation in trading. A notable example is the record $920 million fine in 2020 for years-long manipulation of the precious metals and U.S. Treasury markets. U.S. regulators found that from 2008 to 2016, JPMorgan's traders engaged in spoofing, placing fake orders to deceive the market, and that the bank failed to detect or stop this illegal practice even after internal surveillance flagged issues in 2014. JPMorgan ultimately admitted wrongdoing in this case, a rarity, underscoring how serious the misconduct was. The fact that such manipulation persisted for nearly a decade under the eyes of management signals either willful blindness or insufficient controls, effectively an evasion of market rules for profit. The bank only changed course once government enforcement brought the hammer down. Another glaring compliance failure was JPMorgan's enabling of Jeffrey Epstein's activities. Mentioned again, that's not a good look for you, JPMorgan Chase, through its private bank. Internal documents and subsequent lawsuits revealed that compliance officers flagged suspicious cash withdrawals and unlawful indications related to Epstein. But the bank kept him as a client for a period of time leading up to his conviction. The U.S. Virgin Islands lawsuit alleged JPMorgan, quote, knowingly, negligently, and unlawfully provided banking that aided Epstein's sex trafficking operation. JPMorgan denied wrongdoing, but agreed to pay $75 million in settlement in 2023. As part of settling, the bank committed to implementing measures to combat human trafficking going forward, steps that arguably should have been in place all along. This episode, you're listening to it now, indicates that JPMorgan's controls against illicit activity were insufficient or ignored when profitable clients were involved, effectively evading the spirit of anti-money laundering and anti-trafficking regulations. The scandal was, quote, an historic victory for survivors, unquote, according to the Attorney General, and a wake-up call to Wall Street about banks' duties to detect and prevent such crimes. It is telling that it took legal action by victims and regulators, not JPMorgan's internal governance, to resolve these lapses. Beyond compliance failures, JPMorgan has a tendency to push against regulatory constraints in policy arenas. Jamie Dimon has been an especially vocal critic of financial regulations he deems excessive. in 2023, when U.S. regulators proposed the Basel III Endgame rules, which would significantly raise capital requirements for the largest banks. Dimon publicly blasted the plan as, quote, hugely disappointing, unquote, and lacking transparency. Dimon warned that higher capital would make banks, quote, uninvestable, unquote, and harm the economy. During a September 2023 industry conference, Dimon openly questioned regulators' motives. Quote, do regulators want banks to ever be investable again? Unquote, he asked. And even used profanity, expressing doubt that public comments on the rules would, quote, make a shit of difference, unquote, to regulators. Such blunt public statements reveal JPMorgan's posture. A resistance to stricter regulation and a willingness to challenge regulators both privately and in the court of public opinion. Dimon's rhetoric, quote, bad for America, unquote, quote, we need fairness, unquote, etc., is aimed at pressuring regulators to rethink and at rallying other banks and business groups in opposition. Indeed, JPMorgan is a key player in bank lobbying efforts. The bank's government relations team and trade associations like the Financial Services Forum, which Dimon is very influential in being a part of, routinely lobby lawmakers and regulators to limit new regulatory burdens. For instance, after 2008, Dimon was critical of aspects within Dodd-Frank, like the Volcker rule limiting proprietary trading, and over the years, JPMorgan's lobbying helped carve out exceptions and ensure that rules like Volcker were implemented in less onerous ways for banks. In recent times, JPMorgan joined other banks in successfully pushing the Trump administration and other soft-handed dilettantes and regulators at large to ease certain liquidity and leverage rules. This pattern, pushing back on capital, liquidity, and consumer protection rules, shows JPMorgan often tries to evade the full impact of reforms intended to curb banks' risk-taking. Rather than simply comply and adjust business models, the bank fights to preserve maximum flexibility, arguably at the expense of systemic safety. In the realm of environmental regulation and commitments, JPMorgan also demonstrates evasion or cynicism. While not subject to binding climate regulations yet, the bank makes voluntary pledges. For example, to align financing with Paris Agreement goals. But as noted earlier, JPMorgan continues to fund fossil fuel expansion at staggering levels, undercutting the spirit of those commitments. Regulators and governments are increasingly eyeing climate risks. In response, rather than dramatically reducing fossil fuel financing, JPMorgan has sometimes chosen to exit cooperative efforts that might hold it accountable, like Climate Action 100. Likewise, JPMorgan in late 2022 quietly left the Net Zero Banking Alliance's steering group under political pressure, and along with other big U.S. banks threatened to leave the alliance entirely if strict decarbonization targets were mandated. These actions can be seen as regulatory evasion in advance, preempting future regulatory or quasi-regulatory constraints on carbon financing. The bank appears to want to chart its own course on climate, one that won't necessarily involve rapid fossil fuel phase-out, and it steps away from frameworks that might compel such action. Another facet of the regulatory evasion measure is legal and regulatory accountability. When JPMorgan is caught in wrongdoing, it often negotiates settlements, deferred prosecution agreements, non-prosecution deals, etc., that allow JPMorgan to avoid a formal criminal conviction, as in the spoofing case where a deferred prosecution agreement was used. While this is common for large firms, it means the bank can pay fines as a cost of doing business and move on, arguably without fully internalizing the gravity of violations. Critics argue this regime enables repeat behavior. JPMorgan's recurrence in scandals suggests at times a calculated risk-taking approach. Push until caught, then pay the ticket. Senior management rhetoric often downplays issues as isolated incidents. Quote, the individuals are no longer with the firm, unquote, and so on. You get the gist. Rather than accepting institutional responsibility. This culture can be interpreted as one of compliance when convenient, evasion when profit is to be made and odds of detection are low. Given these observations, Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.95 as JPMorgan's regulatory evasion measure. JPMorgan exhibits a strong tendency to circumvent or resist regulatory oversight through actual rule bending and legal violations, resulting in major fines, through strategic lobbying to block or dilute new rules, and through selective participation in voluntary regulatory initiatives, stepping back when they become too binding. The bank's sheer size also affords it considerable influence. Regulators often consult JPMorgan on policy, meaning it can shape rules to its liking, otherwise known as, quote, regulatory capture, unquote, risk. A Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.95 in the regulatory evasion measure indicates that JPMorgan's behavior has at times undermined the very frameworks meant to ensure a stable and fair financial system. The public statements made by leadership, essentially warning regulators not to overreach, and the pattern of penalties for misconduct reflect a firm that pushes boundaries until authorities push back, rather than proactively complying with the highest standards. This attitude not only endangers JPMorgan's own reputation, but because of its central role in the global markets, can threaten market integrity. For example, spoofing distorted markets, lax anti-money laundering controls facilitated crime, excessive leverage possibly amplifying crises, and so on. In the Proxyopoly TM framework context, such a high regulatory evasion measure means a single proxy vote at JPMorgan on, say, a proposal to improve disclosure or risk controls carries significant weight for public welfare. If shareholders fail to rein in management's risk-taking, the broader market could suffer from the next evasion-induced scandal. And now that we have critically assessed all of JPMorgan's 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, it's time for a short intermission for the Proxyopolist at home to take a break. Go ahead, keep this podcast playing while you drop a huge deuce in the ivory throne, or you can just run to your pantry and find out what kind of snacks you got in there. Leave a comment on what snacks you find in your pantry. Proxyopoly wants to know. Proxyopoly TM is once again soliciting feedback for sponsored content and contributed content to be featured on this podcast. If you would like for your insert company name here or insert musical project name here to be featured on the podcast, reach out to Proxyopoly TM today at the contact Proxyopoly TM option, which can be found on the Linktree, which is linktree/NASCARCOSA. And if you would like any more further instructions or want me to break this down more for you, I don't know what else to tell you. I am giving you everything I have, Proxyopolis. If you're hearing my voice now, you have reached the realm from which there is no return. We are all in Proxyopoly now. Or maybe we're not. Maybe you're just sitting at home and just chilling and listening to my voice for whatever reason. This is still just an intermission. I'm just trying to ask how your day's going. What you doing? You know you got some earwax in your ear pods. Why don't you take them out? Clean them out a little bit. You disgusting Philistine. Proxyopoly TM is grateful for all the listeners and anyone who decides to spend their time to listen to corporate governance practices in the 21st century. Proxyopoly TM is here for you. At any rate, this concludes the first intermission, and if you're still listening, you're about to hear the final Proxyopoly TM score for JPMorgan Chase. Let's pay attention, shall we? And we're back to reveal the final Proxyopoly TM score for JPMorgan Chase. Bringing together the 5 component ratings, the Proxyopoly TM ratings, we derive a JPMorgan Chase's final Proxyopoly TM score, which captures the overall volatility and public impact risk of the company's governance profile. Each Proxyopoly TM rating was assessed on a scale analogous to a beta coefficient, with higher positive values indicating greater risk impact. JPMorgan's ratings across the board are consistently high, reflecting a company that, relative to peers, poses a considerable challenge to shareholder stewardship and potentially to market stability if governance issues translate into unchecked corporate behavior. The following is a summary recap from the Proxyopoly TM Index Master Table of JPMorgan's Proxyopoly TM ratings, summarizing each Proxyopoly TM rating and delivering upon its final Proxyopoly TM score. Proxyopoly TM rating number 1. Proxy accumulation resistance. Proxyopoly TM assigned a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.93. Proxyopoly TM rating number 2. Bylaw Fortification Index. Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.85. Proxyopoly TM rating number 3. Shareholder Hostility Quotient. Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.90. Proxyopoly TM rating number 4. Executive Entrenchment Factor. Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.98. Proxyopoly TM rating number 5. Regulatory Evasion Measure. Proxyopoly TM assigns a Proxyopoly TM rating of positive 0.95. And now we initiate the proprietary weighted calculation of the Proxyopoly TM score for JPMorgan Chase. Beep boop bop beep boop bop bop beep boop bop beep boop bop bop beep boop bop 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 beep beep bop beep. Oh, it's overwhelming, the knowledge. Enough of that. The final Proxyopoly TM score for JPMorgan Chase is positive 1.07. On a scale where positive 1.00 indicates a profoundly high impact risk governance profile, JPMorgan Chase earns a final Proxyopoly TM score of positive 1.07, placing it at the upper echelon of the Proxyopoly TM spectrum. This final Proxyopoly TM score, slightly above positive 1.0, signifies that JPMorgan's governance structure and corporate behavior contribute more volatility and public risk than almost any other company in our coverage. And there will be more. In effect, JPMorgan is a, quote, high beta, unquote, from corporate governance risk perspectives. A score above positive 1.0 suggests that the firm's influence on market health via a single proxy vote or governance decision is disproportionately large and often destabilizing. For context, a neutral company one with balanced governance risks and little public impact risk, might score around 0.0. Did somebody say Proxy 0? No! And an exemplary company with highly shareholder-aligned, transparent practices might even score negative, indicating a stabilizing counter-influence to the norm. JPMorgan, by contrast, tilts heavily towards the risky end of the Proxyopoly TM index in its full breadth of spectrumizations and such. Driving this result is the confluence of entrenched leadership, robust defenses against shareholder oversight, a pattern of confrontation with regulators, and repeated controversies that have required external intervention. Each category feeds into the Proxyopoly TM score. Shareholders face hurdles in influencing change, raising the Proxyopoly TM risk profile as management actions go unchecked. Executives wield outsized authority, raising the stakes of each decision for good or ill. And the company's willingness to test regulatory limits creates a potential for negative spillovers beyond the company. In sum, JPMorgan's governance volatility, its propensity to generate outcomes that can shock or impact stakeholders broadly, is extremely high. This is perhaps not surprising for a bank of its size. However, even relative to other banks, JPMorgan stands out. For example, it has the longest tenured CEO dual role, the highest fossil fuel financing, etc., which elevate these metrics for shareholders and the public. A Proxyopoly TM score of positive 1.07 is a warning sign. It implies that any single proxy votes at JPMorgan, such as on electing a director, approving an executive pay package, or a shareholder proposal on policy, carries an outsized weight on not just the company's future, but potentially on financial market norms and societal outcomes, giving JPMorgan systemic importance and trend-setting role. A vote in favor of the status quo effectively endorses the current high-risk governance trajectory. A vote for change, for example, an independent chair or a critical new director, could have ripple effects in nudging the bank toward more accountability, thereby benefiting the broader market. The final Proxyopoly score for JPMorgan Chase underscores the need for heightened scrutiny and engagement from investors, regulators, and stakeholders when it comes to JPMorgan's corporate governance. In the next sections of this podcast, we translate this analysis of the Proxyopoly TM score into concrete policy change recommendations. And then afterward, voting guidance for the upcoming 2026 Annual General Meeting of Shareholders for JPMorgan Chase. These are aimed at reducing the Proxyopoly TM score over time, implementing reforms that would lower these category ratings and thus diminish the volatility impact of JP Morgan's governance on the free market. Ultimately, the goal is to push JP Morgan's Proxyopoly TM score down closer to a neutral 0, indicating a more balanced and accountable governance structure that aligns the company's immense power with the public interest. And now moving on to the next section of this podcast, governance policy change recommendations. Based on the previous findings of the Proxyopoly TM score, based on the underlying Proxyopoly TM ratings, it is clear that JP Morgan Chase's governance would benefit from significant reforms. Proxyopoly TM recommends the following policy changes to address the high-risk areas identified. These changes aim to improve accountability, align management with shareholder and stakeholder interests, and reduce the firm's exposure to governance-related controversies. Implementing these measures would likely lower JP Morgan's Proxyopoly TM score by mitigating executive entrenchment, reducing shareholder management conflict, and strengthening compliance and transparency. Governance policy change recommendation number 1. Separate the CEO and chairperson roles. Implement independent chair policy. The single most impactful reform would be to formally split the chairperson and CEO positions. Then require that an independent director serve as chair of the board. This should be implemented as soon as possible, not delayed until the next CEO transition, to establish robust independent oversight of management. An independent chair is standard good governance and would ensure that no single individual has unilateral control over board agendas and information flow. Given that 42.5% of shareholders voted for an independent chair in 2024, despite management's opposition, the board should respect this significant investor sentiment and proactively adopt the policy. Proxyopoly TM recommends amending the company's corporate governance principles or bylaws to stipulate separation of the roles, with a truly independent director, not a recent ex-CEO or other insider, as chair. This would reduce executive entrenchment by placing a check on the CEO's power and improve shareholder friendliness, as an independent chair can engage more objectively with investor concerns. Empirical research shows companies with independent chairs often have better oversight and risk management, critical for a bank of JP Morgan's size. If the board is unwilling to demote Jamie Dimon from the chairperson position immediately, at the very least, it should make a binding commitment that upon Dimon's retirement as CEO, which could be within a couple of years, the next CEO will not also be chairperson. and that the chairperson role will be filled by an independent director. Strengthening the existing weak policy into a formal mandate would address core governance concerns. Governance policy change recommendation number 2. Establish stronger board refreshment and tenure limits. JPMorgan should institute term limits for independent directors. For example, max 15 years of service, or at minimum, enforce a more aggressive retirement age to prevent extremely long tenures. As noted, several current directors have tenures that can compromise their independence. Proxyopoly TM proposes adopting a policy that any director who has served more than 15 years will not be renominated and reduce the mandatory retirement age back to 72, reversing the recent move to 75. Additionally, the board should continue its recent trend of adding new independent directors with diverse expertise, and could even expand the board size slightly to bring in fresh perspectives while tenured directors cycle out. A refreshed board with regular turnover is less beholden to management and more attuned to emerging issues. This would in turn lower the proxy accumulation resistance because a dynamic board is more open to shareholder input and less likely to close ranks and reduce entrenchment. Furthermore, Proxyopoly TM recommends rotating committee chairs every 5 years. For instance, having Director Mr. Burke step down as Compensation Committee Chair, given the pay controversies in the past, in favor of a newer independent director would signal accountability. Likewise, an eventual new Risk Committee Chair should be appointed as Ms. Bammann ages out. Regular rotation prevents power silos and groupthink among directors. Governance policy change recommendation number 3. Link executive compensation to long-term ESG and risk metrics. Strengthen say-on-pay accountability. To address shareholder discontent and align management incentives with broader stakeholder interests, JPMorgan should overhaul its executive compensation policies. First, integrate specific environmental, social, governance, and risk management performance metrics into annual and long-term incentive plans. For example, a portion of top executives' pay could be tied to progress on climate risk, such as reductions in financed emissions or increases in sustainable financing as a share of total financing. Customer satisfaction, regulatory compliance outcomes, and employee culture, such as diversity and internal ethics metrics. This would ensure executives are rewarded not just for short-term financial gains, but for managing the bank responsibly and sustainably, helping mitigate the regulatory evasion measure tendency and encouraging proactive compliance. The Compensation and Management Development Committee's reports should explicitly detail how non-financial risk considerations influence pay. Second, JPMorgan should commit to responsive action if say-on-pay votes receive significant opposition. Proxyopoly TM recommends a policy that if say-on-pay receives under, say, 70% support, as it disastrously did in 2022 with only 31%, the board will automatically initiate a thorough review and seek shareholder input on changes, and any special awards or out-of-policy pay elements will trigger a separate shareholder vote. Essentially, the board must never repeat the 2021 retention bonus scenario without rigorous justification and investor dialogue. By formalizing this, it assures shareholders that their voice on pay will be heeded. These steps would lower the shareholder hostility quotient, as shareholders will see management aligning with their interests and concerns, as well as reducing the chance of future shareholder revolts. It also sets a tone at the top that the bank values long-term stability and ethics as much as quarterly earnings. Governance policy change recommendation number 4. Enhance transparency and accountability on environmental, social, and governance, ESG, especially climate, and social impact. In light of JPMorgan's ESG controversies, the bank should take a more transparent and proactive stance to rebuild trust. Specifically, Proxyopoly TM recommends that JPMorgan's Board Public Responsibility Committee, which oversees environmental, social, and governance matters, issue an annual report to shareholders detailing the firm's progress on any key environmental, social, governance commitments, controversies, and how it is managing those issues. For example, candidly disclose the firm's fossil fuel financing versus renewable financing, a metric they've agreed to provide, with clear explanations, and set intermediate targets for shifting that balance consistent with global climate goals. If the bank remains committed to net zero by 2050, it should outline concrete, short-term steps like sector-specific financed emissions reduction by 2030 and link those to business strategy. Additionally, the PRC should review the sustainability criteria of JPMorgan's asset management products to ensure no repeat of the Glencore greenwashing incident. Possibly adopt a policy that any fund marketed as, quote, sustainable, unquote, will exclude companies breaching certain environmental or social norms, even if technically allowed by current lax rules. By tightening internal standards, JPMorgan can preempt regulatory crackdowns on greenwashing and respond to stakeholder expectations. Proxyopoly TM also advises rejoining credible climate initiatives like Climate Action 100 or similar. Once the bank is comfortable meeting the commitments, demonstrating that JPMorgan engages rather than withdraws when collective investor action is needed on social issues in the wake of the Epstein case, JPMorgan should continuously update shareholders on improvements in client due diligence and any other human rights safeguards implemented as part of the settlement. Overall, radical transparency is the antidote to skepticism. These measures would likely reduce the regulatory evasion measure, as the bank shows it is willing to go above and beyond compliance on ESG matters, and they would soften the shareholder hostility quotient by addressing shareholder and stakeholder concerns head-on rather than fighting them. Governance policy change recommendation number 5, strengthen risk oversight and ethical compliance programs. JPMorgan should bolster its internal controls to avoid future regulatory run-ins and scandals, thereby directly reducing its regulatory evasion measure. The board's risk committee and audit committee should commission independent third-party assessments of the bank's compliance culture and risk management, similar to what some scandal-hit banks such as Wells Fargo have done in recent years. For instance, an external review of the precious metals trading controls in the wake of the spoofing settlement could yield recommendations to ensure such manipulative trading can't recur. The bank did enhance surveillance after 2014, but clearly it was not enough. The board should verify that today's systems truly catch and stop such behavior in real time. Proxyopoly TM recommends the bank publicly report on how it has addressed past compliance failings, a section in the annual report or proxy statement outlining, quote, lessons learned and actions taken, unquote, on major incidents. Moreover, introducing a clawback policy that is rigorously enforced. If there are future fines above a threshold or egregious misconduct, the executives overseeing that area should face mandatory bonus clawbacks. JPMorgan has a clawback provision on paper. Using them aggressively would show a no-tolerance stance. Proxyopoly TM also suggests tying part of senior executives' variable pay to regulatory compliance metrics, number of significant audit findings, resolution of regulatory matters, etc., as noted earlier, strengthening with whistleblower programs with board-level visibility into significant whistleblower reports is another way to ensure issues surface before they become multi-billion-dollar problems. By taking these actions, JPMorgan can demonstrate to regulators and investors that it is not evading its responsibilities but rather embracing them. In time, this should lower both the regulatory evasion and shareholder hostility measures, since shareholders often become hostile when management negligence leads to costly fines and reputational damage. Regulators, too, may be less inclined to impose harsh new rules on banks that clearly police themselves well. Governance policy change, recommendation number 6. Adopt a more shareholder-inclusive stance to improve engagement practices. Finally, the board should change its philosophy of engagement from reactive to proactive. Proxyopoly TM recommends JPMorgan proactively seek shareholder input on major governance matters before they become contentious proposals. For example, survey large shareholders on their views about board leadership structure, climate strategy, or political spending transparency, and publish aggregated feedback. If 40% of shareholders consistently support something like an independent chair or a report on lobbying, the board should negotiate a solution or voluntarily implement aspects of it, rather than force annual confrontations. Additionally, consider allowing an employee representative or stakeholder observer on the board or board committee, a practice in some European banks, which could improve board awareness of cultural and societal issues from within, potentially preventing future scandals. While U.S. companies rarely do this, JPMorgan could pilot a non-voting observer from the workforce or community to the Public Responsibility Committee, or PRC for instance, as a gesture of inclusivity. Embracing the new SEC universal proxy rules, which make contested elections easier, and ensuring fair treatment of any proxy contestants will also signal respect for shareholder rights. The board might also publish a, quote, annual shareholder engagement and response, unquote, report documenting not just that they meet shareholders, but what substantive changes come about it. These steps would directly chip away at the shareholder hostility quotient, fostering a reputation of a management team that listens and partners with its owners. Over time, a less hostile, more inclusive approach can reduce contentious votes and build investor trust, which is crucial should the bank face another crisis. Supportive shareholders can be an asset in tough times. In summary, these governance reforms, independent board leadership, refreshed and more independent board composition, alignment of pay with long-term stewardship, transparency in environmental social governance issues including risk, and genuine shareholder engagement form a blueprint for JPMorgan to move from a defensive, insular posture to a progressive, accountable one. Implementing them would likely bring JPMorgan's Proxyopoly TM score down considerably, closer to positive 0.5 or even lower, closer to a neutral rating, indicating reduced governance-related volatility risk. As the 2026 Annual General Meeting of Shareholders approaches, Proxyopoly TM urges shareholders to press for these changes and hold the board accountable for making tangible progress. The next section of this podcast translates this into voting recommendations on the current board of directors to incentivize the board to pursue this agenda toward progress. And now we've reached intermission number 2 of this Proxyopoly TM episode. To allow some time for the Proxyopolists at home to run to the refrigerator, crack open a can of Proxy Pop, and sit back and relax before we talk about the board of directors for JPMorgan Chase and whether or not they should be voted for, against, abstain, or withhold by shareholders at large. Albeit there is no sponsored content or contributed content on this episode, perhaps by design, perhaps I just don't feel like it. But Proxyopoly TM does exist in commerce. I'm willing it. And you can find the proxy papers, the Proxyopoly TM research report accompanying every episode for every company of which Proxyopoly TM has published an episode about, on the link tree by selecting the Patreon option, or you can find it on LinkedIn for free via the Proxyopolists for Proxyopoly TM newsletter. So you can read along while you listen along, and play along with the game of Proxyopoly TM. Once again, Proxyopoly TM provides entertainment services educationally, namely podcasts in the field of business and finance. So now that you've gotten settled in, Proxyopolis, we will be proceeding with the last segment of this podcast, where we talk about the board of directors. How exciting. Enjoy. And now, moving on to the final section of this podcast, the 2026 Annual General Meeting voting recommendations regarding JPMorgan Chase's Board of Directors. At the 2026 Annual General Meeting, shareholders will vote on the election of JPMorgan's Board of Directors. In light of the analysis previously discussed in this podcast, and applying the Proxyopoly TM proxy voting policy and guidelines, which emphasize accountability for governance failings and responsiveness to material controversies, Proxyopoly TM provides the following voting recommendations for each director nominee. Each recommendation is accompanied by a rationale citing specific concerns or positives in the director's record. Proxyopoly TM will recommend against or withhold votes for a majority of directors, reflecting the need for greater accountability and board change given JPMorgan's governance issues. A few directors may earn a full recommendation due to recent appointment or roles that could contribute to a turn toward better governance. Note, withhold has effectively the same desired outcome as against in uncontested director elections under JPMorgan's majority vote standard. However, Proxyopoly TM will use against for simplicity. First director on the board up for re-election on the docket today is Linda Bammann. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation against. Miss Bammann, on the board since 2013, is a former JPMorgan executive, retired deputy head of risk management, and currently chair of the risk committee. Proxyopoly TM recommends against her re-election for several reasons. One being tenure and independence. At 13 years of service, her long tenure raises concerns that her objectivity may be compromised. Her prior employment at the bank also makes her less of an independent watchdog. 2. Risk oversight lapses. As risk committee chair, Miss Bammann oversees the firm's risk controls, yet under her watch, JPMorgan has experienced high-profile compliance failures. For example, the long-running metal spoofing scheme that evaded detection until regulators intervened, and the ABSTAIN client debacle indicating anti-money laundering oversight gaps. These suggest insufficient board-level risk oversight. And 3. Committee involvement in pay. Ms. Bammann also sits on the Compensation Committee and thus was part of the group that approved the controversial 2021 CEO Award, given Shareholder 69% dissent, on pay in 2022. Committee members should be held accountable. Overall, Ms. Bammann epitomizes the entrenched insider, a long-serving ex-executive who has not effectively checked management excesses. Replacing Ms. Bammann with a truly independent risk expert would improve the board. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Ms. Bammann regarding her re-election to the board on the agenda at the annual general meeting. Next director on the board up for re-election on the docket today is Michele G. Burke. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Ms. Burke is a new independent director, joined January 2025, and the current president and CEO of the Hershey Company, with extensive consumer industry experience. Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote for Ms. Burke. As a fresh addition, she has not been implicated in past governance failures and brings an outsider's perspective. She has already been appointed to key committees: Compensation and Management, Development, and Corporate Governance and Nominating Committees, indicating the board values her input. Proxyopoly sees her as a potential change agent. During her short tenure, the board has made some refresh moves. For example, new appointments, possibly her influence contributing to stepping up discussions on succession. While the Hershey Company has its own ESG challenges, such as supply chain labor issues, There are no red flags in Buck's record that suggest hostility to shareholder interests. In fact, her leadership at Hershey has been marked by strategic growth and attention to brand purpose. Her independence was confirmed by the board, and she has no prior ties to JPMorgan Chase. Proxyopoly team wants to encourage new independent voices on JPM's board, so a vote for is warranted. We expect Ms. Buck to exercise diligent oversight, and her continued presence will help dilute the influence of entrenched directors. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for the re-election of Ms. Buck at the annual general meeting. Next director on the board up for re-election on the docket today is Stephen B. Burke. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation. Vote against. Mr. Burke has served on JPMorgan's board since 2004, over 2 decades, making him one of the longest tenured directors. He is the retired CEO of NBC Universal. Proxyopoly TM strongly recommends voting against Mr. Burke's re-election to the board of JPMorgan Chase, citing entrenchment and governance failings. Burke's 21-year tenure far exceeds best practice guidelines for director independence. Many investors consider over 10 to 15 years to potentially compromise independence. Mr. Burke has effectively become part of the furniture of JPMorgan's board, intertwined with management. Moreover, Mr. Burke currently chairs the Compensation and Management Development Committee, which oversaw the disastrous 2021 executive compensation decision. Under his chairmanship, the committee approved the special $52.6 million award to Jamie Dimon with no performance conditions, a move that proxy advisors like Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis and 69% of shareholders opposed. This represents a severe lapse in judgment and responsiveness. As Compensation Committee Chair, Burke bears primary responsibility for failing to align pay with shareholder interests. While the committee cited Dimon's performance and retention as justified, the backlash indicates Burke did not adequately consider shareholder perspective. It's notable that after that rebuke, the board retained Burke as Compensation Committee Chair, a lack of accountability we seek to correct via this recommended vote. Another citation for voting against Mr. Burke: lack of refreshment. As one of the oldest and earliest serving directors, Burke's continued presence impedes board refreshment and diversity of thought. Voting Mr. Burke out would create space for a new independent director, ideally one with expertise in technology or banking. Another citation to vote against Mr. Burke: performance oversight. One might argue JPMorgan has performed well financially during Mr. Burke's tenure, but good performance does not excuse poor governance. Indeed, it can mask it. In sum, Mr. Burke epitomizes the over-tenured director who failed to check CEO pay excess and has been on the board through compliance crises with little course correction. It's time for Mr. Burke to step down. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Mr. Burke at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director on the board up for re-election on the docket today is Todd A. Combs. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Mr. Combs joined the board in 2016 and is an investment officer at Berkshire Hathaway and former CEO of Geico. While Mr. Combs brings valuable financial acumen and the perspective of a major shareholder, whereas Berkshire had been a significant JPM investor, Proxyopoly recommends a vote against, citing the following reasons. 1. Role in the Pay/Compensation Committee. Mr. Combs is a member of the Compensation and Management Development Committee and thus far part of the group responsible for the misaligned 2021 CEO payout. As one of 4 Compensation Committee members, he shares accountability for that decision and the consequent shareholder disapproval. The committee's actions underwhelmed shareholders, so members should be signaled out. Citation 2. Board independence concern. Although Combs is independent of management, his position as a Berkshire portfolio manager means he may have had conflicting loyalties or at least different incentives. Berkshire, led by Warren Buffett, was a large shareholder until 2020, and Combs might have been expected to represent Buffett's interests on the board. Berkshire has since sold its JPMorgan stake, but Combs remains on the board. There's a question of whether Mr. Combs primarily provides oversight or was initially placed to monitor an investment. With Berkshire Hathaway liquidating its position, Mr. Combs' presence is less justified, and one could argue he effectively occupied a seat on behalf of a now exited shareholder, possibly crowding out other perspectives. Another citation to vote against Mr. Combs' minimal unique contribution. Combs' background is in insurance investing. While financial savvy is useful, the board already has multiple finance experts. Meanwhile, the board could use more tech or consumer banking innovation expertise, areas Combs doesn't specifically fill. Also, as an outside director, there's no public evidence that Combs has been a champion of governance reforms or challenging management when needed. Mr. Combs' track record seems aligned with the status quo. He has not, for example, publicly pushed for splitting the CEO chairperson roles or other changes. Given JPMorgan's need for fresh thinking and the fact that Combs has served over 9 years by the 2026 AGM, borderline for independence considerations, Proxyopoly thinks a change is warranted. In summary, because Mr. Combs was part of the problem at the compensation decision and doesn't stand out as a critical voice for needed reforms, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Mr. Combs at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Alicia Boler Davis. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Miss Boler Davis joined the board in 2023. She is the CEO of Alto Pharmacy and formerly a senior operations executive at Amazon. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for her primarily due to her recent appointment and the new perspective she brings. Citations to support the vote for: fresh perspective and diversity. As a black woman with deep operations and technology experience leading Amazon's global warehouses and logistics during her tenure there, Boler Davis adds valuable expertise in efficiency, customer experience, and technology-driven operations, all crucial as JPMorgan invests in artificial intelligence and digital banking. Her outside perspective from the tech sector can help the board oversee management's fintech and artificial intelligence initiatives more critically. She has no known conflicts or prior ties to JPMorgan. The board designated her as independent. Another citation supporting Alicia Boler Davis's re-election to the board: no lapses to attribute. Having joined only recently, she bears no responsibility for past board decisions. She was not on the board during the pay controversy or earlier scandals. If anything, her joining coincided with the board being receptive to adding new blood, which is positive. Another citation supporting the vote for her re-election to the board: reputation for problem solving. At Amazon, Boler Davis was known for tackling complex challenges. She was one of the few black executives on Amazon's S team, and for operational rigor. This skill set can translate into better board oversight on operational risk and customer service issues at the bank. While Amazon's workplace practices had controversies, such as warehouse conditions, there is no indication that Boler Davis was implicated in any misconduct. In fact, she helped steer Amazon through the pandemic supply chain crisis, which demonstrates strong leadership under pressure. Proxyopoly believes she will be an independent-minded director. Removing her would be counterproductive to the goal of board refreshment. Therefore, continuing to support directors like Boler Davis encourages the trend of rejuvenating the board's composition. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Alicia Boler Davis at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Jamie Dimon. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Mr. Dimon is the chairperson and CEO of JPMorgan Chase. Age 69, director since 2004, chairperson since 2006. Given the extensive discussion in this podcast, Proxyopoly TM firmly recommends shareholders vote against Jamie Dimon's re-election to the board at its upcoming annual general meeting in 2026. This recommendation is not made lightly. It reflects governance concerns, not an evaluation of the company's operational performance under his tenure. Citing governance concerns, Jamie Dimon epitomizes executive entrenchment. He holds both top roles as chairperson and CEO and has done so for 2 decades, consolidating unparalleled influence. The persistence of the chairperson-CEO dual role, despite nearly half of shareholders supporting separation in recent years, indicates a disregard for shareholder sentiment on governance. Voting against Dimon's board seat is effectively the only way shareholders can register dissatisfaction with the combined role and press for a transition to independent board leadership. Another citation supporting the vote against Jamie Dimon: accountability for controversies. Under Dimon's leadership, JPMorgan has indeed excelled financially, but it has also accumulated a record of legal and ethical controversies that ultimately fall under the CEO's purview. These include the London Whale risk management failure, the years of market manipulation in trading, the firm's entanglement with Epstein, numerous compliance fines, and the perception of an aggressive stance against needed regulation. While Dimon often deflects blame to rogue employees or external factors, a strong board would hold the CEO accountable for the culture and systems that allowed these issues. To date, there has been little sign of the board holding Dimon accountable. For example, the special award in 2021 was more a reward than a penalty in a period that included several missteps. Another citation supporting the vote against Jamie Dimon is succession planning. By voting against Dimon, shareholders can send a clear signal that succession planning must be a top priority. Dimon's hints about not staying CEO for 5 more years are welcome, but no timeline or successor is currently set. The board's credibility on succession will be judged by actions in the next couple of years. An against vote amplifies urgency to solidify the next generation of leadership and perhaps move Dimon to an emeritus or advisory role. Another citation supporting the vote against Jamie Dimon to the re-election of the board: performance versus governance balance. Some shareholders may be hesitant to oppose an iconic CEO during profitable times. However, given Dimon's overwhelming influence on the board, a withhold vote is arguably the only lever shareholders have to demand governance improvements while still expecting management to run the business day to day. We note that even if Mr. Dimon were not on the board, he could remain CEO. Board membership is not legally required for a CEO, so voting Mr. Dimon off the board would primarily strip him of the chairperson role and formal board presence, forcing the appointment of an independent chair, which could be a healthy governance outcome. In conclusion, Jamie Dimon's leadership, though successful in many business aspects, has become a single point of failure in JPMorgan's governance architecture. To recalibrate the balance of power and institute the changes we have noted in this podcast, Proxyopoly TM urges an against vote regarding the re-election of Jamie Dimon to the board of directors at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. This is a vote for the long-term health of the institution's governance. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against the re-election of Jamie Dimon to the board of directors of JPMorgan Chase. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Alex Gorsky. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Mr. Gorsky joined JPMorgan's board in 2022 after serving as chairperson and CEO of Johnson & Johnson. While he is relatively new to the board, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against his re-election due to concerns about his track record and potential misalignment with strong governance values. Citing the vote against controversies at prior company, as CEO of Johnson & Johnson, Alex Gorsky oversaw the company during a time of significant legal controversies. Most notably, the thousands of lawsuits over Johnson & Johnson's talc-based baby powder containing asbestos, and the company's handling of that issue. Gorsky personally testified that the product was safe, just days before the FDA found asbestos in it, leading to a recall and reputational damage for Johnson & Johnson. The fact that under his leadership, Johnson & Johnson allegedly knew of asbestos traces for years, but continued sales raises questions about Gorsky's commitment to transparency and consumer safety. Additionally, Johnson & Johnson faced major opioid crisis lawsuits and adopted controversial strategies like the, quote, Texas two-step, unquote, bankruptcy maneuver to limit talc liabilities, while Mr. Gorsky was still at the helm. These issues suggest Gorsky's approach to regulation and liability might tilt toward evasion or aggressive defense, a mindset we already set as problematic at JPMorgan. Relevance to JPMorgan: JPM's board doesn't directly deal with talc or pharma, but the parallel is in how a leader addresses large-scale public harm controversies. We worry that Gorsky might not be the rigorous voice for responsibility that the bank needs, given his Johnson & Johnson experience prioritized protecting the company over fully acknowledging public health harm, per lawsuits and investigations. Another citation for the vote against board contributions and independence. Gorsky does bring operational expertise from running a huge global firm and knowledge of healthcare relevant to JPM's expanding healthcare banking. However, the board already has multiple current or former CEOs. Since joining, Gorsky has served on the board for around 4 years by 2026, enough to be partially accountable for oversight during the tail end of some issues. For example, he joined just after the 2021 pay grant, but he did participate in the 2022 to 2023 decisions. He sits on the Corporate Governance and Nominating Committees, which is responsible for the board composition and governance policies. Yet, we haven't seen that committee with him on it champion the needed governance reforms, like moving to an independent chair, proactively or tightening board evaluations. There's no public indication that Gorsky has pushed for changes. Rather, the board's stance remains defensive. Another citation supporting the vote against Mr. Gorsky: time commitments. Gorsky also sits on other boards, Apple Inc. and IBM as of recent years, with JPMorgan being complex and his other commitments. One could question if he can fully dedicate to digging into JPM's thorny issues. In conclusion, Mr. Gorsky's presence on the board does not significantly or sufficiently add unique governance improving value to outweigh the concerns, giving the need for JPMorgan's directors to willfully challenge the status quo. Proxyopoly TM is not confident in Mr. Gorsky that he is that person. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Mr. Gorsky at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Mellody Hobson. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Ms. Hobson has been on JPMorgan's board since 2018 and serves as co-CEO of Ariel Investments and chair of JPMorgan's Public Responsibility Committee. This recommendation is a nuanced one, as Ms. Hobson is widely respected in corporate governance circles and brings strong credentials. We believe an against vote is warranted to hold the Public Responsibility Committee accountable for JPMorgan's environmental social governance shortcomings and to press for more effective oversight on that front. Citing the vote against role as Public Responsibility Committee Chair. As PRC Chair, Hobson oversees the board's monitoring of environmental, social, and governance issues. During her tenure leading this committee, JPMorgan has encountered multiple ESG-related controversies, financing of fossil fuels at odds with climate commitments, the greenwashing critique of the bank's, quote, sustainable, unquote, funds investing in a polluting mining giant, and the decision to withdraw from Climate Action 100, which drew public ire. These events suggest that the Public Responsibility Committee under Hobson's leadership has not effectively guided the bank to anticipate shareholder or stakeholder concerns, neither steering the firm toward best practices. For instance, the Guardian expose on the ESG funds indicated a lack of rigorous standards, something the Public Responsibility Committee should be vetting. Also, one might expect the Public Responsibility Committee to have a say in the bank's climate strategy, yet quitting the Climate Action 100 appears reactive and not well communicated, undermining JPMorgan's credibility on climate action. Another citation for her vote against: shareholder alignment. Hobson has a reputation as a shareholder advocate. She often speaks about financial literacy and has governance experience as former chair at DreamWorks and current chair at Starbucks. However, At Starbucks, where she is board chairperson, she faced criticism from some shareholders for handling of labor issues. At JPMorgan on the board, while she likely supports progressive change internally, we have not seen much tangible improvement in the firm's ESG posture. The bank remains a top fossil fuel financer and resists many environmental shareholder proposals. One could argue that continuing controversies imply the Public Responsibility Committee isn't exerting strong influence. Another citation for the vote against Ms. Hobson: tenure and overboarding. Hobson will have 8 years on the board by 2026. Not too long, but enough to take responsibility for the areas she oversees. Additionally, Hobson's other commitments are heavy. Aside from co-running Ariel Investments, she is chair of Starbucks Corporation and a director of Alphabet, Google's parent, at least until recently. Juggling multiple prominent roles could limit the attention she can give JPMorgan's complex issues. For instance, the Starbucks board, which she chairs, has been embroiled in its own disputes. Shareholder proposals on labor rights got majority support in 2023. The Proxyopoly TM standard calls for critical assessment of any material controversy. Given JPMorgan's ESG track record, holding the Public Responsibility Committee chair accountable via a withhold or against vote is appropriate. In recognizing Ms. Hobson's contributions, we acknowledge Ms. Hobson has likely contributed positively to discussions about inclusion. She is known for advocating diversity. JPMorgan's board is quite diverse now, however, and perhaps supported moves like disclosure of the fossil versus clean financing ratio. However, at this juncture, at the time of this podcast episode premiere, the board needs to feel pressure to significantly step up environmental, social, governance oversight and responsiveness. An against vote for the Public Responsibility Committee chair, Ms. Hobson, sends that message. Proxyopoly TM will also note that given Hobson's stature, a significant withhold or against vote might prompt her and the board to intensify their efforts on these issues, rather than necessarily leading to her exit. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against Ms. Hobson at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Phebe N. Novakovic. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Ms. Novakovic, CEO of General Dynamics, a major aerospace and defense company, joined the board in 2020. This recommendation is a close call. However, Proxyopoly TM leans for her re-election mainly because she brings active CEO experience in a highly regulated industry and has only 6 years of board tenure. Also, we have not identified specific failings on her part in JPMorgan's context, specifically. A citation in support of her re-election to the board is her unique skill set. Novakovic's expertise in government contracting, cybersecurity, and risk, given the nature of the defense business, is valuable for JPMorgan. Banks face cybersecurity threats and complex regulatory compliance issues, areas where an active defense CEO's perspective helps. In 2023, JPMorgan's board formed a new technology and cybersecurity committee. We consider Novakovic's knowledge here an asset worth retaining, whether or not she sits on the Technology and Cybersecurity Committee. Another citation in support of Novakovic's re-election to the board is her independence and engagement. Ms. Novakovic is independent with no prior ties to JPM. As an active external CEO, she likely has a strong sense of oversight. We note General Dynamics under her leadership has had its own environmental social governance controversies. For example, dealing with defense contracts and ethics of selling to certain government regimes globally can be tricky. But those are not directly linked to JPMorgan's business. Importantly, nothing public suggests she's been an obstacle to governance improvements at JPM. Being relatively new, Ms. Novakovic was not involved in the 2012 London Whale era or other earlier regulatory issues, and she joined after the 1MDB case, which involved other banks, not JPM, but contextually we cite for reference. Novakovic did vote on the 2021 special award as a director, assuming the full board approved it, which is a mark against every director of that time. However, she had just joined the board 1 year prior, and it's plausible she deferred to longer tenured colleagues on that decision. Not an excuse, once again, just context for the decision. Since then, there haven't been notable pay controversies. Perhaps the board heeded the 2022 vote rebuke. Another citation in support of her re-election is her time commitment. Serving as a public company CEO while on an external board can be concerning. Some investors feel CEOs should only serve on one outside board or none. Novakovic's only outside board is JPM, which is within typical guidelines. Proxyopoly TM has seen no evidence of her missing meetings or not contributing. If anything, her discipline as CEO could improve board decision-making. Why not against, you may ask? Proxyopoly TM has already recommended replacing a majority of the board with votes against. And we do believe some continuity and industry experience should remain. Removing Novakovic could deprive the board of a seasoned, no-nonsense voice who can hold management accountable. CEOs on boards often ask tough questions, drawing from their own expertise. Additionally, she hasn't chaired any problematic committee. She's a member of the Audit and Public Responsibility Committee as of the 2025 proxy statement. If she were the Public Responsibility Committee chair or Compensation Committee chair, however, our stance might differ, but her role has been as a member. On balance, Proxyopoly TM judges her contribution as positive and sees no direct controversy tied to her performance as a JPM director. We do expect her as a leader used to hierarchy to support succession planning and structural governance improvements once Dimon eventually transitions. Thus, keeping Novakovic on could aid a stable transition. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM formally recommends voting for Ms. Novakovic at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Virginia M. Rometty. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote against. Ms. Rometty joined JPM's board in 2020 after retiring as chairperson and CEO of IBM. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting against her re-election, citing pay committee accountability. Rometty is a member of the Compensation and Management Development Committee and was part of that committee in 2021 when the Dimon Award was granted. She joined the board in Q1 2020, so she was on the Comp Committee by 2021. As with Burke, Bammann, and Combs, she bears responsibility for that poor decision which shareholders overwhelmingly rejected. There is no indication that Rometty dissented or raised concerns, thus holding her accountable is appropriate. The Compensation Committee's credibility was tarnished, and refreshing it through director turnover is necessary. Another citation to support the vote against: mixed track record at IBM. As IBM's CEO from 2012 to 2020, Ms. Rometty had a mixed performance. She led IBM through a difficult transformation period with only modest success. IBM stock and revenues stagnated or declined for much of her tenure, and she faced criticism for not moving fast enough into cloud computing. More relevant to governance, IBM under her watch engaged in large layoffs and was sued for alleged age discrimination in those layoffs. With evidence, IBM targeted older workers to make the workforce younger. Additionally, IBM had controversies around its handling of some employee and diversity issues, though it also did well on others. The age bias allegations led to a federal investigation and tarnished IBM's reputation as an employer. Such issues might raise concerns about her oversight on JPM's board regarding human capital management. Will she be sensitive to workforce and cultural issues or prone to cost-cutting at the expense of morale? Hard to say, but it's a data point. Another citation in support of the against vote for Ms. Rometty: Aramco board seat. As a notable potential conflict, Ms. Rometty serves on the board of Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil company, and has done so since 2021. This is concerning from an environmental social governance perspective. Aramco is a company at odds with climate action, and having an Aramco director on JPM's board while JPM touts climate commitments could be problematic optics. It might also explain a certain mindset on the board regarding balancing climate versus business. Rometty's involvement with Aramco suggests she is comfortable aligning with fossil fuel interests, which might dampen her urgency on JPM's climate risk oversight. Some added value. While Rometty brings technology experience and IBM's background, which is valuable for JPM's tech initiatives, the board already has tech-savvy members. For example, Mark Weinberger has tech oversight experience. Brad Smith from Intuit brings fine tech knowledge. Rometty's tenure at IBM was not seen as an innovation success story, so her tech contributions might be limited to high-level insight. Meanwhile, her presence on multiple boards, she's also on the board of Marriott, and with consulting roles could stretch her thin. Given she has served 6 years by 2026, and in that time we haven't seen her catalyze visible governance improvements at JPMorgan Chase, we believe it's reasonable to seek a replacement. In conclusion, Ms. Rometty falls into the category of big-name ex-CEOs whose governance contributions do not obviously outweigh the negatives, such as pay committee misjudgments or external conflicts. Proxyopoly TM advises a vote against to signal that shareholders want a revamped compensation committee and perhaps more independence from fossil fuel affiliations. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends a vote against Ms. Rometty at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. Next director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Brad D. Smith. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote for. Mr. Smith joined the board in 2025. He is the former CEO of Intuit and current president of Marshall University. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for his re-election, citing fresh addition and expertise. Smith is one of the newest directors elected effective January 2025, so he has had little time on the board yet. We see value in his technology and fintech background as a longtime CEO of Intuit, maker of TurboTax, QuickBooks, etc. He has deep experience in consumer finance technology, data security, and innovation. JPMorgan can benefit from that as it competes with fintechs and invests in digital banking as well as artificial intelligence. Smith's profile also includes work on economic development and environmental social governance matters. Intuit, under his leadership, had programs for inclusive growth, and he co-founded a foundation for education. The proxy statement mentions his, quote, demonstrated leadership in creating opportunities for underserved communities, unquote, indicating a commitment to social responsibility that could bolster the board's perspective on stakeholder issues. A citation in support of the vote for Mr. Smith with no legacy issues. Smith bears no responsibility for past controversies and enters with a clean slate. If anything, his presence is a result of shareholder pressure to refresh the board. We want to encourage this ongoing refreshment by supporting new directors. In regard to independence, he is independent with no prior JPMorgan ties. His other board service is moderate. He sits on a couple of other boards like Amazon, previously mentioned in this podcast series, since 2023, but not overextended. In fact, his joining Amazon's board and JPM's board in quick succession suggests his skills are in demand, and we can leverage that at JPMorgan. There's no conflict of interest apparent. Intuit isn't a competitor or a major counterparty to JPMorgan. Citing committee roles in support of the vote for, according to the proxy statement, Smith has been assigned to the Compensation Committee and the Corporate Governance and Nominating Committee. It's notable that the board put him on the Compensation Committee immediately, likely to inject new thinking after the 2022 Say on Pay fiasco. It is thought that having Sam on that committee is beneficial. As a former CEO who did not receive outlandish pay at Intuit, and who managed compensation in a tech company, he likely brings perspective on aligning incentives with innovation and shareholder returns. Since joining, there's no report of pay controversy, so perhaps his input is positive. We would like for him to continue contributing to fixing the compensation approach going forward. For example, incorporating more performance metrics, avoiding egregious awards of the past. In conclusion, Brad Smith represents the kind of forward-looking, experienced, yet independent director JPMorgan needs more of. Voting for him affirms the refresh strategy and keeps a technology innovation voice in the boardroom. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM recommends voting for Brad D. Smith at the upcoming annual general meeting of shareholders. The final director of the board up for re-election on the docket today is Mark A. Weinberger. Proxyopoly TM voting recommendation: vote abstain. Mr. Weinberger joined the board in 2024 and is the former global chairperson and CEO of Ernst Young. Proxyopoly TM recommends voting abstain on his re-election, citing some positives and some negatives, ultimately resulting in not an against and not a for vote. Citing audit and risk expertise in the positives, Weinberger currently serves as Audit Committee Chair, a crucial role he took on upon joining, given his extensive background in accounting, finance, and public policy. By all accounts, he is well qualified as a past Big Four accounting CEO and a former U.S. Assistant Treasury Secretary. He deeply understands financial reporting, internal controls, and regulatory compliance. In the past year or so that he's chaired the audit committee, there have been no public issues with JPMorgan's financial reporting. The bank navigated the 2023 regional bank turbulence successfully, and presumably the audit committee provided oversight on credit risk under his leadership. Replacing Weinberger with a vote against would leave a void in audit expertise. Another citation for the abstain is fresh perspective and active oversight. Though not on the board long, Weinberger seems to be an engaged director. The proxy statement highlights his, quote, comprehensive experience in a highly regulated industry combined with governance policy positions, unquote. Exactly what JPMorgan's board needs to navigate complex regulations such as Basel rules, etc. His presence likely strengthens the board's interactions with regulators and understanding of new accounting standards or compliance requirements. For example, if capital rules tighten, Weinberger can be there to help the board challenge management's assumptions and ensure accurate regulatory reporting, hence why we are not voting against. To clarify, the major concerns in consideration for the vote abstain is Weinberger's independence. Weinberger is independent and has no prior ties to JPMorgan. He does serve on other boards, however, such as Johnson & Johnson, MetLife, and most notably on the board of Saudi Aramco since 2019. The Aramco position, as with Ms. Rometty also on the board of JPMorgan Chase and Saudi Aramco, is a bit of a double-edged sword. The experience gives him insight into global energy, helpful for JPM's lending exposures, but is also seen as a conflict in climate matters. Weinberger's main value add is audit and governance. However, Aramco likely sought him for this financial acumen. Proxyopoly TM has weighed this, finds his retention beneficial, but will not support his re-election with the vote for. Ergo, we urge him and the Public Responsibility Committee to be cognizant of climate optics and recognize the message sent with the vote abstain. An honorable mention of Weinberger's experience in support of not voting against his re-election, merely voting abstain, is his compensation and governance outlook. Weinberger's broad view suggests he appreciates stakeholder governance, being involved with initiatives on inclusive capitalism. He might be a voice bridging shareholder and public interests. Also, given his role at Ernst Young, he likely has low tolerance for compliance failures, a mindset JPM needs to avoid future fines. We expect Mr. Weinberger to support many of the recommendations made in this podcast. For example, he likely favors stronger controls and transparency. Since joining, Proxyopoly TM hasn't seen any votes or actions from him counter to shareholder interests. With regard to continuity in audit leadership, changing the audit committee chairs too often can be destabilizing, hence why we are not voting against Mr. Weinberger. Mr. Weinberger just took that post in 2024, and normally one would serve several years. We believe he should continue to drive improvements in JPM's audit, risk, and control environment. For example, ensuring internal audit aggressively tests things like the trading desks after the spoofing case, etc. There have been no reasons presented to oust him with a vote against, and doing so could be counterproductive. However, Proxyopoly TM cannot outright support him on overboarding and independence grounds. Ergo, Proxyopoly TM formally recommends a vote abstain with regard to Mr. Weinberger's re-election to the board. Having now provided recommendations for the entire board of JPMorgan Chase, in total we recommend voting for 4 directors, against or withhold 7 directors, and abstain for 1 director. The mix of against votes is deliberately focused on those with the greatest responsibility for governance lapses. For example, compensation committee members from the 2021 debacle, board leadership, and public responsibility committee chair for environmental social governance issues. The 4 votes support newer directors who can be part of the solution, bringing fresh perspectives in technology, operations, audit, and risk. The 1 abstain vote, obviously on the grounds of independence, overboarding, and the counterproductive nature of ousting audit committee chair. Nonetheless, this slate of recommendations is intended to encourage significant board change. If shareholders follow these votes and the company honors majority voting, several long-tenured or accountable directors would be replaced. We would expect the governance and nominating committee with new members like Smith and Buck to then recruit truly independent, diverse, and expert replacements. Perhaps a climate risk expert, a fintech entrepreneur, etc. Even if not all recommended against votes result in director turnover, since some may still get over 50% if large shareholders support management, a strong signal will be sent. The board as a whole should interpret any significant withhold percentages as a mandate to accelerate governance reforms outlined in this podcast. Shareholders of JPMorgan Chase should be aware that CEO Chairperson Jamie Dimon's presence on the ballot is especially consequential. A vote against Jamie Dimon is a vote for independent board leadership and enhanced accountability. If Mr. Dimon is not reelected, which would be unprecedented for a sitting CEO of a major bank, the board would be compelled to immediately appoint a new chairperson, an independent director, and possibly reconsider his role as CEO. Even a substantial minority against vote in this regard, say 30 to 40%, would be a loud message. Similarly, heavy against votes for compensation committee members would push the board to reshuffle that committee and adopt more shareholder-friendly pay practices. In conclusion, Proxyopoly TM urges shareholders to follow these recommendations to help reshape JPMorgan's board in a manner that will support long-term sustainable value creation and reduce the firm's Proxyopoly TM score to a more neutral level to the benefit of public interest. A reconstituted board, more receptive to shareholder input and more rigorous in oversight, can guide JPMorgan Chase to be a better balanced bank in terms of profitability with prudence and responsibility. JPMorgan Chase stands at a governance crossroads. The Proxyopoly TM score of positive 1.07 underscores that the bank's current governance structure, defined by an ironclad leadership, fortified bylaws, and a history of sidestepping shareholder and regulatory demands, poses a significant volatility and public risk factor. In many ways, JPMorgan's governance profile is a product of its success. A dominant franchise led by a legendary CEO has bred a degree of insularity and resistance to change. But as stewards of this institution, shareholders must look beyond past profits to the foundation on which future performance will be built. Strong, responsive governance is not a nice-to-have, it is a requisite for sustainable success, particularly for a systemically important bank that can impact the global financial system. This report has critically examined JPMorgan through the lenses of the 5 Proxyopoly TM ratings, revealing clear areas for improvement. Yet we also see glimmers of progress. The board has added fresh talent in recent years and has signaled, albeit weakly, that it will eventually embrace independent leadership. JPMorgan's management, for its part, has shown the capacity to adapt when truly necessary, namely how the firm fortified itself after the London whale incident, or how it navigated the pandemic era. The challenge now is to channel that adaptability toward modernizing the bank's governance. Implementing the governance policy changes outlined in this podcast, from splitting the CEO chairperson roles to tightening risk oversight and aligning pay with long-term goals, would help reduce JPMorgan's Proxyopoly TM score closer to a more neutral rating at the benefit of public health. Proxyopoly TM believes these reforms are realistic and in line with emerging best practices among leading companies. They are not about undermining management, but about creating the proper checks and balances to ensure management's decisions are optimal and consider all stakeholders. In the long run, such governance will enhance JPMorgan's resilience and reputation, which are pillars of shareholder value. The 2026 Annual General Meeting Board voting recommendations provide a roadmap for shareholders to effect change. By voting out certain entrenched or accountable directors and supporting newer, skilled ones, shareholders can help reconfigure the board's composition in favor of a more critical and forward-thinking board. This is perhaps the most direct lever investors have. If the voting results reflect our recommendations, for example, if a substantial number of directors receive less than majority support, the board will be compelled to listen. Even the prospect of that should galvanize the incumbent directors to accelerate voluntary changes ahead of time. One cannot discuss JPMorgan's governance without acknowledging Jamie Dimon's towering presence. His contributions to the bank's success are undeniable, but so too is the reality that no leader is irreplaceable and no empire benefits from unchecked rule. The transition to a post-Dimon era, whenever it comes, will be one of the biggest tests of JPMorgan's governance. It can either be a smooth handoff orchestrated by a proactive board or a turbulent power vacuum if left too late. Our analysis strongly favors the former. Begin the transition planning now, with clear oversight and involvement from an empowered, independent chair or lead director. Doing so will lower the executive entrenchment factor and signal to the market that JPMorgan's fortunes are not wed to one individual. It is worth noting the broader context. Public trust in financial institutions. Banks are under the microscope to demonstrate they operate fairly, ethically, and with consideration of systemic risks. JPMorgan, as the industry leader, sets the tone. A JPMorgan that embraces stronger governance, that constructively engages with shareholder concerns on climate and social issues, that self-polices risk and executive rewards, will not only improve its own standing but also raise the bar for peers. Conversely, should JPMorgan continue on the path of high Proxyopoly TM risk, it may invite more intense regulatory intervention or public criticism, which ultimately could constrain its operations and growth. In closing, Proxyopoly TM reiterates that JPMorgan Chase is a fundamentally robust institution with vast strengths, talented employees, diversified businesses, and a history of innovation. Governance reform is about fortifying those strengths by eliminating weaknesses that could otherwise fester. By adopting the recommendations in this Proxyopoly TM report, JPMorgan can reduce governance-related volatility, better protect the general public health of free markets, and ensure its continued leadership is profitable and principled. Shareholders are proxy holders of the company's future. Proxyopoly TM urges you to use that proxy power at the 2026 Annual General Meeting of Shareholders to vote in line with long-term interests. Vote for an accountable, refreshed board and for policies that secure JPMorgan's legacy as not just the biggest bank, but also one of the best governed. If these changes are implemented, we expect JPMorgan's next Proxyopoly TM assessment to show a markedly lower score, a tangible indicator of progress toward governance excellence. The opportunity for change is now, and it is in shareholders' hands to seize it. Let's ensure that JPMorgan Chase's governance evolves to meet the challenges and responsibilities of its outsized role in the financial world. And thanks for listening to the podcast, Proxyopolis. As always, we conclude with the final disclaimer. The Proxyopoly TM score and accompanying analysis are purely hypothetical for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real-world events is purely coincidental, though with JPMorgan Chase's current trajectory, reality may be catching up faster than anticipated. And that's all the time we have for this episode, Proxyopolis. If it ain't Proxyopoly TM, you're Proxyopolying.